I'm Bret Collier. I'm a professor of wildlife biology at Louisiana State University.
Hey, I'm Jason Lupardus, work for Turkeys for Tomorrow, and technically a wildlife biologist. And so we're going to talk a little bit about habitat today and what these birds need across the nation because they're really generalist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you think about the wild turkey and the success story of restoration of wild turkeys in the United States, what most people really focus on is habitat and vegetation management. And turkeys are super interesting because we're talking about a bird that can live in the swamps of Alabama, Georgia, Florida. It can live in the Appalachian Mountains. It can live in the hardwoods of the upper Midwest. It can live in the plains of Texas and Kansas and the Dakotas, the foothills of the mountains.
North America.
Wait,
other countries.
Other countries. We've got probably the stronghold for the Goulds is in Mexico, in the mountains of Mexico. And across all of these areas, the only thing these areas have in common is turkeys.
Wait a second. I'm interrupting you.
Okay.
You forgot an area. You can have turkeys in your backyard.
In your backyard.
We're seeing nuisance issues even in suburbs.
Yep.
I mean, it's crazy. I've had some in my backyard.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I forgot about our nuisance friends, but turkeys are a broad generalist when it comes to habitat needs and vegetation that they require. They can live on mountains. They can live in almost semi-arid and arid desert regions. They can live in hardwoods. They can live all over the place. So they've got a very wide niche, a very wide set of areas they can use. And for most of the year, they're a generalist in everything. All they need to be able to do is eat and sleep. But whenever it gets specific, that they have really specific vegetative and habitat requirements, is during the reproductive period.
Yes, it's so important. And so, I've met with, I don't know, I was telling Bret the other day, I've met with over 1,000 landowners over time. And every landowner I've met with, honestly, if there's one thing that I can say is very consistent across the board, in general, is nesting and brood range is probably the most limiting factors that I've seen on most properties when I talk to landowners just about turkeys. And I'm not talking about deer and turkeys, but just turkeys. And that's a big deal. And I'm not going to go into the deer turkey arena because a lot of folks go, hey, if I imagine great for deer, I'm going to have a lot of turkeys. Not necessarily.
No.
Because if you're intensively managing for deer, it's much different than intensively managing for turkeys. So let's talk a little bit about what those needs are because this brood range I think is critical.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
By far. But let's first start about nesting. What does that look like? So
nesting is the critical period for turkeys because it's when we make babies and we replace the birds that we harvest every year, okay? So basically what production we get this year is going to be the birds we're going to have the opportunity to hunt in 2 years, okay? So nesting's a really interesting window. You've got a bird that's tied to a dot on a map where she puts her nest for approximately 40 to 42 days, okay? She takes about 12 to 14 days to lay her eggs. Usually she wears somewhere between 11 and 13 in that ballpark. Sometimes they skip a day in there. And all that time that she's laying an egg, she's wandering around her nest site where she's at to try and figure out what resources are there because turkeys don't actually look for where they're going to put their nest. Like all of us, I got you. All of us, whenever we go buy a new house, right, we go see a whole bunch of houses. And we evaluate the kitchen, and we evaluate the bathroom, and we want to see if the master suite is okay, and is there a basement? And for me, I want to know if I can put a tree stand in the front yard, right?
That's right.
But we evaluate. Turkeys don't operate like that. They get bred, then they get up one morning, and they wander off. And they move outside of their range. And at some point during the next day or so, they recognize that physiologically they need to lay an egg. So they stop and they find a bush or the base of a tree or an area on a cutover or whatever.
Depends on where they are.
And they put their nest there. But they don't know anything else about that area. They lay their first egg, they cover it up. So what they do is they prospect. They start looking around the area where they've laid their egg at to try and figure out what resources are there. There's a graduate student, actually recently graduated student, named Dr. Nicholas Backner, who was at the University of Georgia, and he's at Tennessee Tech now, who did his entire dissertation on this topic. Looking at the fact that once they lay an egg, they've got to go find resources on the landscape. So they have to search all around them, because once they sit on that nest, they're stuck in this area that's a few acres for 28 days. So they're going to be there. It's like, I jokingly say, it's like being in the downstairs bathroom of a 2,000 square foot house for a month, right? That's where they're going to be. And they've got to know where resources are at. So what these females are generally looking for is early successional vegetative communities. That's pretty well established in the turkey literature. That has some available water, that they can forage in rapidly and efficiently whenever they have to leave the nest, so they can go out, get food, and get back, because the more time a turkey spends on the nest, the higher the probability the nest is successful. Okay? So if she's making fewer trips on and off the nest to get resources, that means she's opening herself up less to predation. She's not potentially drawing any, site predators like crows or something in on her. That's good. If she has to make a bunch of trips off the nest regularly fails as well.
Absolutely.
So we want her to be able to stay close and everything, right?
So let's clarify this right now so everyone understands this. So these birds are not really going out on a landscape going, I'm looking for the perfect home.
Right.
And so I think this is a very important topic, because I've heard many people say, oh, these birds they're going to go over here to this field and because this is the field they've been looking for. That's not the case. No. The case is that if you have a sea of habitat, I can't remember who said this. I know a bunch of us said it over time, but if it's a sea of good habitat, the likelihood of this bird dropping a nest on that day in the sea of habitat, it increases that opportunity for nest success. So here's the goal here. Listen, we need habitat across a property, across properties, in order to have more successful nests and to really create more birds in the future, right?
Right, absolutely. And the trick is, what's really cool is, while this hen's nesting and all these areas that she's prospected, that's where she takes her broods. Mm-hmm. That's what we're seeing, is the areas that she's went and looked at.
It's that tight niche area.
When she hatches successfully, she goes to those areas that she's already checked out, that she knows has the resources for her broods. So, and they're these females are super linear. It surprised even me. I thought that, they'd start at the nest, they'd kind of do circles looking for areas where they want to go. Nope. Whenever that brood hatches, they go a direction, and they never vary from that direction. They know where they want to be. The closer, going to your sea of habitat question, the closer that there is quality brooding vegetative communities to where she goes, the better. The farther a brood has to travel in the first few days, the more likely it is to die. Yep. So as long as they have quick access to good early successional brooding habitat, that helps that brood, those group of poults, that brood to survive.
Absolutely. So we're not going to go into all the dynamics of how to get there, but I think it's important. A lot of folks will ask, what does the perfect nesting habitat look like in brood range? And I like to try to pull some of that together at times just to get people to understand. But when that turkey is basically walking through, and if they want to pull that head up and look, if they can look directly over the cover, that's really the ideal situation. Because when she's down and she's moving through, especially with poults, then they can be in cover and they can't be seen as well. And so a lot of folks are like, oh, well, I see a lot of birds out on these mowed strips, and I got to be honest with you, that's not a good thing, okay? We want to not be able to really see these birds at this time of the year. We want them to be in cover and protected, so that once they advance in age and then we can see them, then the likelihood of survival goes through the roof.
Absolutely. And what I tell people when I go to properties is, I say, get down on one knee, and you want to look out, and you want to be able to see the tops of all the bunch grasses and everything, and you want to see green down at the bottom, but you also want to see brown. You want to see dirt, because poults, when they're little, can't climb over big clumps of cool season grasses. They can't make their way through them. They need to be able to get down to the dirt to move through it.
Bare ground.
Bare ground. You cannot be just bumping over grass all the time. So what you want to have is I don't want to use the word matrix, but you want to have it so it looks like there's a whole bunch of clumps of vegetation out on the ground and lots of little forbs and that kind of stuff out there. And there's several ways to manage for that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
and I'm going to throw out real quick. A lot of folks in the past were all about putting strips of things down. Okay, I'm going to strip this in, or I'm going to plow a strip right through this field, move over 30 yards, and do another one. We don't want to do that. Number one, it provides all of your mammalian predators the opportunity with their nose to come in and scent things out, to see things, and so it really introduces more critters into these environments. So we want things on more of a block kind of format for management. And so whether you're using prescribed fire, we're looking at trying to do forest management, we're going out there with equipment, maybe herbicides, whatever that may be, to keep that habitat in place.
Right.
It's really critical.
Yeah.
And the blockier it is, the better for these hens.
Right. And by block doesn't mean square.
Doesn't mean square.
Blocks can be any sort of weird shape, and the weirder the shapes they are, sometimes the better. It doesn't have to be square. It's creating a bunch of different vegetative communities that all butt up and transition with each other, as opposed to just having one monoculture of early successional community, or one monoculture of open pine, or one monoculture of hardwoods. You want to have blocks of those that fit on the landscape kind of naturally, that create all those transition zones, because those zones are actually where a lot of those broods end up hanging out. Thermal cover, they're able to nest in there and get insects. Quick to escape cover. They're away from any of those long linear corridors like roads, which we don't want. So yeah.
So a lot of folks will also ask, like, how do we have this? How do we maintain it? And everywhere you go, it's a little bit different. Every property's different depending on your soils, where you are. But let me give you a good generalization. If you're not doing some type of disturbance on a 1 to 3 year interval, depending on where you are, the further south you are, the more frequent you have to do things. We got a lot more sunlight. Dirt's pretty good, sandy soils. It grows weeds really fast, and you got to manage that more aggressively.
Yes.
Okay. The further north you go, it's so much different. You can lag a little further behind and still have good habitat. But what I've even seen in my home state up in Kentucky is that if we're not managing still on a 2-year basis, we start losing nesting habitat, and basically it starts turning into a very high cost value to push back the woody species. So ideally, and if I'm going to throw a number out, ideally, if you had a 2-year rotation doing anything, you can really keep good brood range and nesting habitat over time.
Right. A lot of what we've seen we work on a lot of public properties in the Southeast, especially, obviously with me being at LSU. And in our southern pine forests, our pine hardwood dominated forests, we burn. And I say we, usually it's Forest Service or the state agency, burns on a 2 to 3 year rotation. And that's really important for us, because what we see from nesting is hens, these females, go out and they're selecting to nest in areas that are burned a year ago or 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
But by year 3, it's almost too thick. They don't like it because there's not as much ability to move through it, and it's not always bad, right? But they like that stuff that's been burned a couple of years, and they're putting all their nests in there. And what's nice about that is that it helps us as agency people and biologists to rotate those burns through. So you've always got plenty of 1 and 2 year burns, 1 and 2 year roughs we call them, out there on the landscape, such that the birds have lots of different places to choose, and their nests aren't at risk for being burned.
Absolutely.
On the landscape, which is an important, we hear, because I get a lot of questions on that on spring burns. Are we burning up turkey nests? The answer is no. Fire is good, and those birds are nesting in areas that aren't up usually for burning in the years that we're burning.
All right, we're talking about burning, so we're going to go in a little more detail here.
Okay,
this is a hot topic, right? No pun intended. But oftentimes, folks get really caught up in like, hey, we're going to float out or change our interval of burn or when we're going to burn, right? And we have a lot of dormant season burning. It's a very safe time of the year. The humidity's right. Conditions are there. And we're seeing some spring burns. But let me throw this out there. I know some research that Craig Harper and others have done on really seeing when some of the best weed communities come back is when we have disturbance into the late summer, into the fall.
Yes.
And so I'm going to encourage, and sometimes conditions aren't exactly perfect, but I would really like to encourage folks to think about trying to light a match at that time of the year. because then we're going to have a flourishing of legumes and other seedy vegetation that's very good for our hens, very good for gobblers. And I tell you, it could have dramatic impacts on how we're managing habitat. And then it may even wash away some of the thoughts of concerns of even burning up one nest, right?
Yeah, and as an advocate, we generally advocate, any sort of disturbance on the landscape you get is good. And there's no reason not to burn in the fall. There's no reason not to disc. There's no reason not to throw a disc out there in the fall, right? Historically, we've done most of our burning as dormant season burning because it's easier to manage. It typically doesn't get as hot. But there is definitely a place for doing summer burns, real hot summer burns, and even fall burns.
Right.
And all of those should be considered under any sort of land management type of plan. Because you do, as Dr. Craig Harper at the University of Tennessee, who spent a career looking at vegetation management. He's probably one of the experts in the world on creating vegetation. He's shown that you actually get a much different and more diversity based on when you burn on the landscape. So there's nothing wrong with having fall burns as opposed to nothing wrong with having spring burns.
Absolutely. I think a lot of folks don't think about that.
Yeah, for sure.
We just need to really bring that to light. And I got to be honest with y'all. If you want to put a burn on the ground at any time of the year, it is one of the absolute best places in the spring for a bird to come strutting in. And a lot of these early seeded panicums and other things come up. I've seen a ton of hens come in here working those areas, and they're really hot spots for birds. It makes a great place to hunt.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll throw in here is we talk a lot about fire, but that's not to say that mechanical management doesn't work. Running a disc, running a roller chopper, going out there and bush hogging at the right place at the right time.
Absolutely.
That's not going to hurt. It also doesn't mean that chemical, some sort of herbicide doesn't play a role. If
maybe a combination.
Yeah, we've got a ton of multifloral rows that's come up on one of our places in Illinois, and that's literally going to be my summer, is going up there and starting to try and knock all of it down so I can get some fire going through it, just from a place that we've got that we just haven't spent a lot of time working on. So
absolutely. So once again, these disturbance intervals, we're talking about the same thing. Ideally, 2-year window, you're going to be good. Some places, I've been down in the deep south where you almost have to burn areas every year. Just to keep the vegetation down so it will carry a burn in subsequent years. So you have to think about that, depending on where you are in the U.S., what your fire law is, so to speak, and what you can do to have the benefits you want to have more birds.
Yeah, and whenever we think about kind of these general habitat conditions that we're creating for these birds, one of the big questions I get asked a lot is roosting habitat, because, and that's really weird, right? Because we don't manage roosts at all on the landscape. We really don't. But
wait, we do need to manage roosts.
We do need to manage roosts. But
wait, it's let me define this, because this is important if you hunt. Because I'm one of these guys, I'm pretty hardcore about it. Managing roosts for me means we don't interrupt roost sites. Do not go into roost sites. Do not try to go sit under birds. That's a no-no. What you don't want to do is push birds off your property.
Right. But we don't, as managers on the ground, we don't really manage for a specific tree for birds to roost in. We don't.
Exactly.
Probably the only place where that becomes an issue is some of the riparian corridors in the Great Plains, the Central Plains of the United States, where we've lost a lot of cottonwoods historically. I think Texas would be a good example, where cottonwoods have basically just trailed off due to drought. And, we don't have roosting trees in those areas. And obviously there's no roosting trees. There's not going to be any turkeys. But in most of east of the Mississippi, roosting habitat is readily available. These birds can kind of find a place to get up and get into about every day. But your point about not disturbing roosts, generally speaking, you don't want to disturb roosts at all. But the birds seem to be moderately resilient, and they seem to have some areas that are core roosts and some areas that are satellite roosts based on some of the GPS information we've collected, where there are places they hit fairly regularly. I don't want to give like an exact day because we don't really know. Let's say a couple times a week. And then there are places that they're sporadically at, maybe once every month that they happen.
Let's talk about how many average roost birds have. Is it like 7 to 10?
All over
something like that?
It's all over the map, depending on where you're at.
Y'all need to listen up.
Yeah, and this is important in that. And I've said this a lot to folks. You might go to a spot and have a bird roosted up on a Monday, and then go back to that same spot and have a bird roosted there on a Wednesday, that's probably not the same bird. That's probably just a spot where birds roosted because these birds are continually moving around the landscape. That's probably not the same bird that was there. And that bird that you heard Monday might not be back for 2 weeks, or he could be back on Thursday. But they constantly are in movement. So don't think that it's the same bird all the time. And our GPS data on these birds shows it really clearly. Now, that's for Easterns. When you start getting into Rio country and Merriam's a little bit
Much different.
Much different. Those birds have a really, really high site fidelity for roost sites. So they'll almost.
Why is that?
There's not as many trees.
There you go.
There's not as many trees. They're usually tied to the riparian corridors. And it's not the individual tree. It's like the clump of trees. Their entire day will be spent, all right, I'm going to walk in a big circle, and I might not sleep in the same tree, but I'll be 50 yards away from it in a different tree, or 150 yards away from it in a different tree, but I'm in the same area. So their roost site fidelity is significantly higher due to just the fact that they're limited on the landscape. So for Easterns, it's pretty low fidelity. For Rios and Merriam's and Goulds, for that matter, the fidelity gets a lot higher. So
let's talk about one thing to kind of finish this out. And we've talked a lot about private public lands and habitat. And to be honest with you, if we're looking at this at a scale, especially in the eastern U.S., where we're tend to see a little bit more issues with turkey numbers, right?
Correct. Yes.
We really feel that private lands is where we're going to have an impact to really change our bird populations. And knowing that, it depending on what state you're in and what you look at, but it's well over 85% of the eastern U.S. is privately owned. And so I know with Turkeys for Tomorrow, we're discussing trying to work on private lands, wild turkey cooperatives, to try to bring landowners together to better manage habitat, everything you can think of under the sun, even trying to do some predator management in there, to do this at a scale, to try to be impactful on birds. And so we have to start thinking about how do we do this and create what I call incubators, or areas we could really have these larger source populations that's going to help everyone there. Because as we know, working with, like if you look at like Onyx or one of those guys and you look at how many landowners are on a map, like I could pull up my Onyx map and you look and you can see like 20 different landowners exactly where we are, right? And some of them may own 5 acres, 20 acres, 50 acres. And we start thinking about this on what if each one of those folks are out there trying to, quote unquote, harvest a bird?
Right.
And what are each one of those folks doing to try to better manage for birds? Can we have sustainable harvest in those areas or not? So these are things that's in my mind, in our mind, of what we're going to do to try to address that from a habitat scale, from managing people, added to mortality, many of the things that we're talking about to try to address.
Yeah, and one of the things that people, just turkey hunters, need to recognize across the is that conservation and sustainability of the wild turkey in the United States is a private land problem. It cannot, especially east of the Mississippi.
Oh, it's not a problem.
It's
an opportunity. There you go.
Right. Okay.
There you go.
It is private lands east of the Mississippi is where the opportunity is for wild turkey conservation. Most of the land is privately held. Turkeys are going to be sustained and populations are going to rise and or fall based on what the collective we of government, state agencies, NGOs, we are able to do to get better, more activity, management, conservation, implementation on private lands. We cannot sustain turkey populations, the turkey population east of the Mississippi, just on public land. There's just not enough of it. Turkeys are going to rise and fall in the United States based on what we do on private lands. So that's the call to arms, I guess, for conservation is how do we as agency, as university personnel, working with state agency personnel, working with NGOs, facilitate information exchange and information transfer and support to do conservation actions on private lands.
Absolutely. Great point. I think we're good.
Okay.
Was that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. So
We
we'll do a
hit
close out on that. And you can,
Okay.
Most of these you can say, look, there's a lot of information with all this stuff.
Sure.
Same thing.
I'll let you do it.
Okay.
Y'all covered parts of it, and then you can even tell people we want to hear from y'all, comment on stuff.
Sure.
However you want to handle it. But Yeah, we'll redo that. I've heard it out recently.
I've been sitting out here listening.
Sure. Hey, there's so much information. You can reach out to either one of us, turkeysfortomorrow.org. We're looking to work with private landowners across the United States, especially here in the Southeast where we're seeing some turkey issues. It's the only thing we can do to try to address it, and we need your voice. We need the citizen scientist out there, you, the turkey hunter, to come help us.
Awesome.
Do you want me to make a statement in there to push towards state agency, university extension folk, and state agency
yeah,
people
we could
as well?
do- yeah,
can
I
I-
think
can we,
you should do
can we
that.
tap on that? So, all right. So,
I'm being selfish.
no, it's okay. No, I'm trying to do that. I'm just. Do you want to be selfish on this?
No, I'm good. Go ahead. Add
Okay.
that in. I think it's good.
I'd also add. Hang on. I'd also add to what Jason said about working with your NGOs. You should definitely be in contact as private landowners with your state wildlife agency and with your university extension personnel who put a lot of time and a lot of effort into communicating with our private landowners about opportunities for engaging them in various land management activities, conservation easements, or any sort of thing that we can do to help put more and better habitat on the ground for wild turkeys.
Absolutely. USDA, NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, in many of the states, there's an entire suite of people that can help you. So there's a ton of resources. Reach out, see what we can find out, and we'll be glad to try to navigate you in the correct direction.